Turkey isn't confused about its place in the world. Everyone else is. One day it's a key NATO ally guarding Europe's southern flank. The next it's negotiating energy deals with Moscow and flexing muscle in the Middle East. That contradiction isn't a mistake, it's the strategy. In Turkey geopolitics, choosing sides is seen as weakness and standing in the middle is framed as power. But here's the uncomfortable truth. What looks like control can quickly turn into exposure when global pressure starts to rise. This is where things get personal for nations like Turkey. When inflation eats away at savings, when the currency loses credibility, and when voters feel the squeeze, foreign policy stops being abstract. Erdoğan foreign policy thrives on projecting strength abroad to maintain stability at home. Yet that same approach fuels NATO tensions, strains Turkey-EU relations, and complicates Turkey-Russia relations. It's a high-wire act where applause comes early, but the real danger shows up later, quietly, suddenly, and without warning. So the real question isn't whether Turkey is playing a smart game, it's whether this game can still be won in a world drifting toward sharper lines and fewer gray zones. Stay with me until the end, because understanding Turkey's dangerous balancing act doesn't just explain one country's choices, it reveals how global power politics are changing for everyone, and why the middle ground may soon be the most dangerous place to stand. Turkey's story starts with geography, and not the boring map kind. This is real, lived geography. Sitting astride the Bosphorus, controlling access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, Turkey doesn't just connect continents, it controls movement, energy flows, and military access. In Turkey geopolitics, location isn't a footnote, it's the entire opening act. For centuries, empires fought over this exact spot, from Byzantines to Ottomans, and that legacy still shapes today's geopolitical strategy. Think of Turkey as the homeowner who owns the only bridge in town. Everyone needs access, and nobody wants to anger the gatekeeper. This unique position makes full alignment nearly impossible. Turkey's NATO membership ties it to Western security architecture, yet its proximity to Russia, the Middle East, and Asia forces constant negotiation with rivals of the West. In global power politics, Turkey isn't choosing neutrality out of idealism, it's doing it out of necessity. Roughly 45% of global maritime trade passes near Turkish-controlled waters, and energy corridors from the Caspian and Middle East run straight through Anatolia. Walking away from one bloc would mean sacrificing leverage over the others, and Ankara knows that leverage is its strongest currency. But here's the catch. Not choosing sides comes at a cost. Allies don't fully trust you, rivals don't fully fear you, and crises test the limits of ambiguity. Turkey's dangerous balancing act works best in calm times, not during moments of NATO tensions or great power confrontation. It's like juggling knives, impressive when everything's steady, disastrous when the room starts shaking. That tension sets the stage for how Turkey-NATO-Russia dynamics become both a source of power and a growing liability. Turkey's NATO membership is supposed to be straightforward, but in practice it's anything but. Ankara joined the alliance in 1952, positioning itself as the southeastern shield against Soviet expansion, and that legacy still shapes today's Turkey geopolitics. Yet over time, Turkey realized NATO wasn't just a security umbrella, it was also a bargaining chip. By controlling access to the Black Sea through the Montreux Convention, Turkey can influence naval movements of both NATO and Russia, giving Ankara leverage that few allies possess. It's the diplomatic equivalent of holding a master key while everyone else has copies. Then came the moves that made Western capitals uneasy. Turkey-Russia relations deepened through energy pipelines like Turkstream, nuclear cooperation with the Akkuyu plant, and most controversially, the purchase of Russia's S-400 air defense system. That decision triggered U.S. sanctions and Turkey's removal from the F-35 program, a rare punishment for a NATO member. From Ankara's perspective, it wasn't betrayal, it was insurance. When I explain this to students, I compare it to diversifying investments. Turkey didn't want all its security assets tied to one portfolio, especially after feeling sidelined by allies in Syria. This strategy, however, amplifies NATO tensions and raises questions about trust.
Western leaders see unpredictability. Turkey sees autonomy. Erdoğan foreign policy plays this tension deliberately, extracting concessions by positioning Turkey as indispensable but never fully compliant. The risk is obvious. When pressure rises between NATO and Moscow, the space for maneuver shrinks fast. And once that space narrows, Turkey's ability to keep playing both sides without consequences comes under serious strain, especially when domestic politics enter the equation. To understand Turkey's foreign moves, you have to understand Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, because Erdoğan foreign policy and domestic survival are tightly fused. Over the past 2 decades, Erdoğan transformed Turkey from a parliamentary system into a powerful executive presidency, concentrating decision-making at the top. National pride, sovereignty, and independence aren't just slogans, they're political tools. When the economy slows or inflation spikes, projecting strength abroad becomes a way to rally support at home, a pattern seen repeatedly in Turkey geopolitics. Economic pressure plays a huge role here. Turkey has faced persistent currency weakness, with the lira losing over 80% of its value against the dollar since 2018, and inflation peaking above 70% in 2022. In moments like these, compromise with Western institutions feels politically dangerous. Leaning into Turkey-Russia relations or pushing back against Turkey-EU relations allows Erdoğan to frame external criticism as foreign interference. I often compare this to a CEO under shareholder pressure who launches bold expansions, not always because they're safe, but because standing still looks like failure. Balancing global power politics also helps Erdoğan manage internal power centers, from the military to business elites. By keeping multiple doors open, NATO, Moscow, the Gulf, and Asia, he prevents any single bloc from gaining too much influence over Turkey's future. But this geopolitical strategy narrows Turkey's margin for error. One miscalculation abroad could ripple directly into domestic instability, making every foreign decision feel like a high-stakes gamble rather than a long-term plan. And that gamble becomes even riskier when Turkey steps into active regional conflicts. Turkey's balancing act becomes most dangerous at the regional level, where theory turns into boots on the ground. In Syria, Ankara has conducted multiple military operations to push back Kurdish militias it sees as security threats, even when those groups were backed by the United States. At the same time, Turkey coordinates tactically with Russia to avoid direct clashes, a perfect snapshot of Turkey-NATO-Russia contradictions in action. It's a chessboard where Turkey plays with pieces from opposing sets, hoping the board doesn't flip over. The Eastern Mediterranean adds another layer of tension. Disputes with Greece and Cyprus over maritime borders and energy exploration have strained Turkey-EU relations and raised fears of escalation between NATO allies. Turkey's logic is cold and transactional. Energy independence reduces vulnerability, especially when imports already strain the economy. In the Caucasus, Ankara's strong backing of Azerbaijan during the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict expanded Turkey's influence, while signaling that Turkey-Middle East strategy and Eurasian ambitions are tightly linked. From drones to diplomacy, Turkey is willing to test limits to gain leverage. Refugees have become another strategic lever. Hosting nearly 4 million Syrian refugees gives Turkey enormous bargaining power with Europe, but also fuels domestic resentment. I've seen policymakers describe this as strategic fatigue. The tools still work, but every use carries higher costs. Sanctions threats, diplomatic isolation, or accidental escalation are no longer abstract risks. In global power politics, Turkey's regional gambles are paying off for now, but each success raises the stakes for the next move, and the margin for error keeps shrinking. The real stress test for Turkey's dangerous balancing act is no longer diplomatic, it's economic. Turkey's foreign reserves remain under pressure, external debt stays high, and investor confidence rises and falls with every geopolitical headline. When your currency is fragile, every foreign policy decision suddenly has a price tag. In Turkey geopolitics, leverage only works if markets believe you can absorb the consequences, and that belief has become shakier in recent years. global polarization is also tightening the screws. As global power politics shift toward a more rigid, multipolar order, the space for ambiguity shrinks. Washington expects clearer alignment, Moscow demands loyalty, and Europe grows less patient with transactional diplomacy. Turkey, NATO, Russia dynamics that once created flexibility now risk becoming fault lines. I often compare this moment to walking a suspension bridge in strong wind. You can still move forward, but every step requires more balance, more focus, and more luck than before.
The question isn't whether Turkey's geopolitical strategy is smart, it clearly has been, but whether it's sustainable. A single escalation, a misread signal, or a sudden economic shock could force Ankara to choose faster than it wants to. Turkey's strength has always been its ability to sit between worlds, but history shows that being indispensable can turn into being isolated if timing goes wrong. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes Turkey's future both fascinating and deeply unstable. Turkey's story leaves us with a challenge, not a verdict. Understanding Turkey geopolitics means recognizing that flexibility can be a strength, but only if it's paired with economic resilience and strategic clarity. For policymakers, investors, or even students of global affairs, the lesson is practical. Diversification of alliances works best when your fundamentals are strong. Countries, like people, can't keep borrowing credibility forever without eventually paying interest. So ask yourself this. In a world shaped by global power politics, is it smarter to pick a side early or to stay adaptable for as long as possible? Can Turkey, NATO, Russia dynamics remain a source of leverage, or will polarization force hard choices sooner than expected? And what happens when Erdoğan foreign policy collides with economic reality at home? Does strategy adjust, or does pressure explode outward? If this analysis helped you see beyond headlines and slogans, imagine what applying this kind of thinking can do for how you understand other global conflicts. Let me know what you think in the comments. Share your perspective, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because the next geopolitical shift might already be in motion.